This senior cat sat in the shelter for years. The vet's age discovery shocked everyone. The morning light filtered through the high windows of the Riverbend Animal Shelter, casting long shadows across the rows of enclosures that lined the converted barn. Dashiell pressed his orange paw against the cool metal bars of his cage, watching as the first volunteer of the day unlocked the main entrance. He had performed this exact motion 1,047 times by his own count, though of course no one knew he was keeping track. The metal felt familiar beneath his pads, neither comforting nor cruel, just constant, like everything else in this place that had become his entire world. The card clipped to his enclosure read, Dashiell Senior Cat, approx. 12 years old, adoption fee waived. The handwriting had faded slightly over the months, the laminated surface scratched from being removed and replaced during cleaning. Dashiell had watched that card accumulate its imperfections, the same way he had watched families pause, read it, and continue walking toward the kitten section at the far end of the building. He no longer looked up with the desperate hope he had felt during his first weeks here. Hope, he had learned, was exhausting. His coat, once a vibrant flame of orange and white, had taken on a dullness that made even the kindest volunteers sigh when they cleaned his space. He groomed himself meticulously, but malnutrition had left its mark long before he arrived at Riverbend. The shelter staff assumed the lackluster fur was simply age catching up with him, another sign that he was sliding into those difficult senior years when cats became harder to place, harder to love, harder to see, as anything but a burden waiting to happen. Dashiell settled onto the worn blanket that had been donated during last winter's supply drive. It was grey with small yellow stars, and it smelled faintly of lavender fabric softener. He kneaded it gently with his front paws, a behavior he had never quite outgrown despite everything that had tried to strip away his capacity for comfort. The rhythmic motion soothed something deep in his chest, some memory of safety that existed before the highway, before the hunger, before the understanding that the people he had trusted could simply decide he was no longer convenient enough to keep. The barn that housed Riverbend had been renovated 15 years earlier by a coalition of local animal lovers who wanted to create something better than the cramped, underfunded county facility. The original wooden beams remained visible in the ceiling, and the smell of old hay never quite disappeared despite the modern ventilation system. The main area was divided into sections, one for cats, one for dogs, a small medical room and an office where Coralie Jang spent most of her waking hours trying to balance budgets that never quite balanced. Outside, the fields of lavender that surrounded the property were preparing for their spring bloom. The farm that owned the land had agreed to lease this structure to the shelter for almost nothing, recognizing that having an animal rescue operation nearby was good for their agri-tourism business. Visitors who came for the lavender often stopped by the shelter, and occasionally, very occasionally, they left with a new family member. Dashiell heard the familiar sound of Isolde's backpack dropping near the supply closet. She was early today, arriving before her usual Saturday morning shift. Through the bars, he watched her move through the routine she had perfected over the past 6 months. Hang up her jacket, tie back her dark hair, wash her hands with the precision of someone who had been taught that proper protocols mattered. She was 16, thin in the way of teenagers who forgot to eat when anxiety swallowed their appetite, and she had barely spoken 3 words to any of the adult volunteers during her first month at Riverbend. But she spoke to Dashiell, not in the high-pitched baby voice that some people used, but in low, honest sentences that assumed he understood more than anyone else believed. And perhaps that assumption was not entirely wrong. "Morning," Isolde said softly as she approached his enclosure, crouching down so they were at eye level. Her knees cracked slightly with the movement. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep either." Dashiell stood and walked to the front of his cage, his amber eyes meeting her brown ones. He had learned to read human faces with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural, though it was nothing more than survival instinct honed over countless interactions. Isolde's expression today carried the weight of something unresolved, tension in her jaw, shadows beneath her eyes that makeup did not quite hide. She had not slept well, or perhaps had not slept at all. He lifted his right paw and touched it gently against the bars, not quite reaching her face, but making the gesture that had become their greeting. Isolde extended her finger, and they touched through the metal, a connection that meant more than either could have articulated. For her, it was the only interaction of her day that did not require performance or pretense. For him, it was evidence that recognition still existed somewhere in the world, that someone saw him as more than a category on a clipboard. "Dr. Holloway is coming today," Isolde continued, opening his cage with practiced ease. "Full checkup for all the long-term residents. That means you, unfortunately." Dashiell did not resist as she lifted him out. His body had learned compliance, though not surrender. There was a difference, subtle but significant. He allowed her to carry him to the examination area, a small room off the main space that smelled of disinfectant and the fear of dozens of animals who had passed through it. The steel table in the center gleamed under fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly unreal. Maris Holloway arrived 20 minutes later, her veterinary bag slung over one shoulder and a travel mug of coffee in her hand. She was 38, but could pass for younger, with the kind of energy that came from genuinely loving her work rather than simply tolerating it. She had grown up in this region, spent summers following her father on house calls to farms where he treated everything from dairy cows to beloved barn cats. When he retired, she took over his practice, expanding it to include regular volunteer hours at Riverbend. "This is Dashiell?" Maris asked. Though she had examined him twice before during her rotating schedule, she always asked, always made the introduction as if they were meeting fresh. It was a small kindness that most people did not think to extend to shelter animals. "Yes," Isolde confirmed, her hand resting lightly on Dashiell's back. "He's been here 11 months now." 11 months, Maris repeated, setting down her coffee and pulling on examination gloves. "That's a long time to wait." She ran her hands over Dashiell's body with professional efficiency, checking for lumps, testing joint flexibility, listening to his heartbeat through her stethoscope. Dashiell remained still, his amber eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that made Maris pause mid-examination. "He's very alert," she commented. "Good muscle tone considering. Let me check his teeth." This was always the worst part. Fingers prying open his mouth, the indignity of having his gums inspected like he was a horse at auction. But Dashiell had learned that resistance only prolonged discomfort, so he allowed it, breathing through his nose and focusing on the small window across the room where morning light was growing stronger. Maris frowned. She pulled her fingers back, then gently opened his mouth again, looking more carefully this time. Her frown deepened. "Isolde, bring me more light, please." The teenager grabbed the portable examination lamp and positioned it where Maris indicated. The veterinarian leaned closer, her trained eyes scanning Dashiell's teeth with an attention that had shifted from routine to curiosity. "That's unusual," Maris murmured, more to herself than to Isolde. "What is?" "His teeth. They're remarkably clean for a 12-year-old cat. Very minimal tartar buildup, no significant recession of the gums." She sat back, studying Dashiell with new interest. "When was his last dental assessment?" Isolde pulled the file from the nearby cabinet, flipping through the sparse documentation. "Intake examination 8 months ago. The shelter vet noted his teeth were in decent shape, but attributed it to good genetics." "Maybe," Maris said slowly, "or maybe something else." She returned her attention to Dashiell, running her hands along his spine, checking his flexibility again with more focused intent. "His joint mobility is excellent. No arthritis that I can detect, no stiffness in the hips or shoulders." "Is that bad?" Isolde asked, worry creeping into her voice. "No, not bad. Just inconsistent with what I would expect from a senior cat who has been through obvious hardship." Maris pulled out her stethoscope again, listening to Dashiell's heart from multiple positions. "His cardiovascular function is strong. Respiratory system is clear. I want to run some blood work." "Is something wrong?" Isolde's hand had moved protectively to Dashiell's head, her fingers gently stroking behind his ears where he had always been sensitive. "I don't know yet," Maris admitted, "but I believe in paying attention when things don't add up. We've been treating Dashiell as a senior cat because that's what he looked like when he arrived. Underweight, dull coat, lethargic behavior. But now that he's been on consistent nutrition and care, I'm seeing details that don't match the profile." She drew blood from Dashiell's front leg with practiced efficiency, filling 3 small vials that she labeled carefully before placing them in her bag. Dashiell barely flinched during the procedure, his stoicism so complete that it seemed almost rehearsed. "I'll run a full panel," Maris said, making notes in the file. "Metabolic markers, thyroid function, kidney values. If there's something medical going on that's been missed, we need to know, and I want to do a comprehensive dental X-ray next week." "Will he be okay?" Isolde's voice had become very small, the confidence she showed around animals evaporating when faced with medical uncertainty. Marius looked at the teenager, recognizing the anxiety that went beyond normal concern for a shelter cat. She had seen Isolde grow over the past months, emerging from her shell only in Dashiell's presence, as if he held some key to a version of herself she could not access alone. "He's going to be fine," Marius assured her, though the promise carried the weight of things still unknown. "I'm just being thorough. That's what good medicine looks like." Dashiell was returned to his enclosure, where he immediately retreated to his blanket and began grooming himself with focused attention. The blood draw site on his leg was barely visible, but he licked it anyway, processing the morning's disruption through the familiar ritual of self-care. Around him, the shelter was coming fully to life as more volunteers arrived, their voices blending into the background noise he had learned to tune out. Beckett, the shelter's live-in maintenance man, shuffled past carrying a toolbox and whistling tunelessly. He was 68, officially retired from his career as a building inspector, and living in the small cottage at the edge of the property in exchange for keeping Riverbend's aging infrastructure functional. His relationship with Coralie was one of mutual respect built on the understanding that they were both people who had been discarded by families who no longer saw value in them. He had 3 children who called once a year on his birthday if he was lucky. She had parents who had stopped speaking to her when she chose animal welfare over the law career they had planned for her. He paused at Dashiell's cage, studying the orange cat with the kind of long, measuring look that made Dashiell uneasy. Beckett had a way of seeing through pretense, of recognizing when things were not as they appeared. "You're an interesting one, aren't you?" Beckett said quietly. "Everybody's looking right past what's actually there." Then he continued on his way, leaving Dashiell alone with that cryptic observation and the unsettling feeling that came from being truly seen. The Saturday adoption hours began at 10 o'clock. Coralie unlocked the front doors, her professional smile already in place, despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. She was 42, with black hair she kept in a practical bun, and a wardrobe consisting entirely of clothing she did not mind getting covered in fur or other less pleasant substances. Her office was a chaotic landscape of grant applications, donation receipts, and photographs of successful adoptions that she pinned to a corkboard as evidence that this work mattered, that they were making a difference, even when the numbers said otherwise. The first family through the door had 2 young children who immediately ran toward the kitten area, their excited squeals echoing off the barn's high ceiling. Their parents followed more slowly, already smiling at the inevitable outcome of this visit. They would leave with a kitten, probably 2 since the shelter offered discounts for bonded pairs. They would not even glance at the adult cat section, let alone the corner where Dashiell and the other long-term residents waited in their patient desperation. A middle-aged couple paused near Dashiell's enclosure. The woman bent down, reading his information card with the kind of deliberate attention that made his heart rate quicken, despite his best efforts at emotional detachment. "Oh, honey, look at this one," she said to her husband. "He's a senior. Poor thing has been here almost a year." The husband joined her, peering into the cage where Dashiell had strategically positioned himself in a patch of sunlight, knowing that the warmth made his coat look slightly better, slightly more alive. "We talked about a senior cat," the woman continued. "They're harder to place, and we have the time to give one a good retirement." Hope, that treacherous emotion, flickered in Dashiell's chest. He stood up, stretched carefully to show his flexibility, and walked to the front of the cage. He had learned certain behaviors made people more likely to consider him, showing alertness without aggression, making eye contact without staring, demonstrating that he understood how to be a companion rather than just a dependent. "He is cute," the husband admitted, "but 12 years old, that's getting up there. We could have him for what? Maybe 3 or 4 years if we're lucky. And senior cats come with medical costs. Dental work, kidney issues, all that. The adoption fee is waived," the woman pointed out, though her voice had already lost some of its enthusiasm. "Sure, but that doesn't cover what we'll spend at the vet. Remember what happened with your parents' cat? Those last 2 years were thousands of dollars in treatment." He straightened up, his decision clearly made. "I think we should look at the younger adults. Still plenty of cats that need homes, but we'd have more time with them." They moved on. Dashiell watched them go, the flicker of hope extinguishing as completely as it had ignited. This was the pattern, repeated with minor variations. People came with good intentions, they considered him briefly, and then they calculated the cost, not just financial but emotional. The investment in a creature whose remaining time could be measured in months rather than years. And who could blame them? In a world of limited resources and unlimited need, why choose the ending over the beginning? Isolde returned during her lunch break with a sandwich she barely touched, settling onto the floor near Dashiell's enclosure. She had learned that eating near him made the meal feel less solitary, less like another activity she performed alone, while the rest of the world moved in patterns she could not match. 3 kittens got adopted, she reported quietly. And that young tabby that came in last week. Coralie is happy about that. It's been a slow month. Dashiell appreciated that she spoke to him like this, providing information without requiring response, creating a space where communication did not demand performance. He moved to the front of his cage and settled into a loaf position, his paws tucked beneath his chest, his eyes half closed in contentment that was not entirely performed. "Doctor, Holloway seemed really interested in you," Isolde continued. "I've never seen her so focused during a routine exam. She kept looking at you like you were a puzzle she needed to solve." She paused, taking a small bite of sandwich without tasting it. "I hope you're not sick. I don't think I could handle that." The vulnerability in her admission hung in the air between them. Dashiell opened his eyes fully, meeting her gaze, and made a small chirping sound that was not quite a meow but carried acknowledgement nonetheless. Isolde smiled, a real expression that transformed her anxious face into something younger, lighter. "Yeah," she said softly. "I know. We're good." The afternoon stretched on with its familiar rhythms. More visitors came and went. 2 dogs in the canine section were adopted, prompting celebration among the volunteers. The kitten room, temporarily emptied by the morning's adoptions, was restocked with a new litter that had been found in a barn on the outskirts of town. Coralie updated the website, took photos, and responded to emails from potential adopters who would, statistically speaking, never actually visit the shelter. As the day wound toward closing time, Soren Blackwell arrived with his camera equipment. He was a freelance photographer who donated his services to Riverbend, creating professional quality images for their social media and promotional materials. He was 29, with the kind of carefully curated appearance that suggested someone who had made aesthetics a primary life concern. Vintage band t-shirts, expensive denim, hair that looked artfully messy but required significant maintenance. "I want to do a special series," he announced to Coralie, already adjusting his camera settings. "Something that highlights the long-term residents. Show people what they're missing." Coralie looked up from her paperwork, hope and skepticism fighting for dominance in her expression. "That would be wonderful, Soren. We could really use something that generates engagement. I'm thinking dramatic black and white, maybe some color accents, real emotional impact." He was already scanning the room, his artistic eye evaluating subjects. That orange cat, the senior in the corner. "He's got something." "Dashiell," Coralie provided. "He's been here 11 months. "Perfect." Soren approached the enclosure with his camera already raised. "Can I take him out? I want to shoot him in natural light, maybe by the windows." Isolde, who had been organizing supplies nearby, stepped forward. "I'll get him." She lifted Dashiell from his cage with the gentle confidence of repeated practice, carrying him to the area Soren had selected. The late afternoon light streamed through the high windows, golden and forgiving. Soren positioned Dashiell on a wooden bench that had been donated years ago, its surface worn smooth by countless animals. "Just let him be natural," Soren instructed, circling with his camera. "I'm not looking for posed, I want authentic." Dashiell sat on the bench, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws, and stared directly at the camera. There was something in his expression, not defiance exactly, but a kind of weary dignity that made Soren pause mid-shot. "Damn," Soren muttered. "You've got presence, buddy." He spent 20 minutes photographing Dashiell from different angles, capturing the way the light caught his amber eyes, the subtle patterns in his orange and white coat, the elegant lines of his body that spoke of a grace that had survived despite everything. When he reviewed the images on his camera's display, he felt that familiar rush of having captured something real, something that transcended the usual limitations of shelter photography. "These are going to be powerful," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "There's a story in this cat." He showed a few shots to Coralie, who leaned in close to study them. Her expression shifted from professional interest to something more complex, a recognition of what Soren had managed to capture. "He doesn't look like a 12-year-old cat in these photos," she observed quietly. "He looks Younger. Vital. Good lighting, Soren said automatically. But even as he spoke, he was studying the images again, seeing what Coralie had noticed. The cat in these photographs did not match the narrative of the aging senior written on his information card. There was an energy in those eyes, a physical presence that suggested reserves of strength still untapped. "I'll get these edited and posted this week," Soren promised, packing up his equipment. "Maybe they'll generate some interest." After he left, Coralie stood alone in the dimming light of the barn, staring at Dashiell, who had been returned to his enclosure. She pulled his file, reading through the sparse details of his intake examination, the assessments that had placed him firmly in the senior category. Everything had made sense at the time. His condition, his appearance, his behavior, all pointed toward a cat in the later stages of life. But now, looking at him with fresh eyes, with Soren's photographs still vivid in her memory, and Maris's unusual interest that morning, she felt the first stirrings of doubt. What if they had been wrong? What if the story they had been telling about Dashiell, the narrative that shaped every interaction and decision, was built on assumptions that had never been properly questioned? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. If they had been wrong about something so fundamental, what else had they missed? And more importantly, how many potential adopters had they sent away with incorrect information, people who might have made different choices if they had known the truth? Dashiell, unaware of these questions swirling around him, settled onto his blanket as the shelter prepared for night. The building grew quiet as volunteers finished their tasks and headed home to their own lives, their own concerns. Isolde was the last to leave, as she often was, pausing at Dashiell's cage for their evening ritual. "See you tomorrow," she whispered, touching her finger to the bars where his paw waited. "Sleep well." But Dashiell did not sleep well. He rarely did. The nights were long and filled with sounds that kept him alert. Other animals shifting in their cages, the old building settling, the distant howl of coyotes in the fields beyond the lavender. He dozed in fits and starts, his body trained by months of this existence to remain partially vigilant even in rest. Somewhere in the darkness, Beckett made his nightly rounds, checking locks and ensuring all the animals had water. He paused at Dashiell's enclosure longer than necessary, studying the orange cat with that same penetrating attention he had shown earlier. "They're starting to see it," Beckett said quietly, "starting to ask the right questions. Won't be long now before everything changes." Then he continued his rounds, leaving Dashiell alone with those cryptic words and the weight of secrets he did not even know he carried. The building settled into its nighttime rhythms. Outside, the lavender fields waited for spring, their plants holding dormant potential that would explode into purple beauty when the timing was right. Inside, dozens of animals waited for their own transformations, their own moments of being chosen, of mattering to someone enough to be taken home. And in his cage in the corner, Dashiell waited too, not knowing that forces were already in motion that would unravel everything he thought he understood about his identity, his past and his future. The truth was coming, patient and inevitable as the changing seasons, and it would shake the foundations of everyone at Riverbend. But for now he simply waited, as he had waited for 1,047 mornings, pressing his paw against the cold metal bars and counting the passage of time in the only way he knew how. The results arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered via secure email to Maris Holloway's clinic. She had just finished examining a diabetic beagle whose owner could barely afford the insulin, let alone the comprehensive care plan the dog really needed. The compromise they reached involved discount medication and a strict monitoring schedule that placed most of the burden on an already overwhelmed family. It was the kind of medicine Maris practiced most often. Not ideal care, but survivable care, the best possible outcome given impossible constraints. She sat at her desk with a cup of tea that had gone cold while she worked, opened her laptop, and pulled up the lab results from Dashiell's blood panel. Her trained eye scanned the columns of numbers, looking for the abnormalities she had half expected to find: kidney dysfunction, thyroid issues, signs of diabetes, or other metabolic disorders common in senior cats. Instead, she found values that made her breath catch. Everything was normal. Better than normal, actually. Dashiell's kidney function was excellent, his liver enzymes pristine, his glucose levels perfect. His thyroid was working beautifully. His white blood cell count suggested a robust immune system, and his red blood cell parameters indicated oxygen transport efficiency that would be enviable in a cat half the age he was supposed to be. Maris sat back in her chair, staring at the screen as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. She had been a veterinarian for 14 years, had analyzed thousands of blood panels, and had developed an instinct for when something was medically wrong. This was not that. This was the opposite of that. She pulled up Dashiell's file from Riverbend, reading through the intake notes with new scrutiny. The initial assessment had been performed by Dr. Chen, the shelter's regular volunteer veterinarian who rotated through once a month. His notes were thorough but not exceptional. Adult male appears senior based on body condition, dental wear, and general presentation. Estimate 10 to 12 years. Malnourished, dehydrated, mild upper respiratory infection. Recommend standard senior care protocol. It was a reasonable assessment, given what Chen had been working with. An underweight cat with dull fur and lethargic behavior, clearly suffering from prolonged neglect. Anyone would have drawn the same conclusion. But reasonable was not the same as correct. Maris picked up her phone and called Riverbend. Coralie answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone juggling too many urgent matters simultaneously. Riverbend Animal Shelter, this is Coralie. It's Maris Holloway. I need to talk to you about Dashiell. The urgency in her tone made Coralie pause whatever she had been doing. Is something wrong? Is he sick? No, quite the opposite actually. His blood work came back and Coralie, everything is perfect. Too perfect for a 12-year-old cat who has been through obvious hardship. Silence on the other end, heavy with implications. Then, carefully, what are you saying? I'm saying I think we need to seriously reconsider our age assessment. I want to do that dental x-ray I mentioned, and I want to do it soon. Can you bring him to my clinic tomorrow? Tomorrow is... Yes, I can make that work. Coralie's mind was already racing ahead, calculating consequences. Maris, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, I'm not suggesting anything yet, Maris interrupted. I'm following the evidence. But we need to be thorough before we jump to conclusions. Bring him tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and Coralie, don't mention this to anyone else yet, not until we know for certain. After the call ended, Coralie sat in her cluttered office, staring at the wall where photographs of successful adoptions competed for space with overdue bills and grant rejection letters. Dashiell's story had been woven into Riverbend's narrative over the past 11 months, the senior cat who deserved a comfortable retirement, the overlooked elder who represented everything wrong with society's obsession with youth and convenience. They had posted about him, built fundraising campaigns around him, used him as the face of their senior adoption program. What would it mean if that story was wrong? Not just incorrect, but fundamentally false from the beginning. The next afternoon, Isolde accompanied Dashiell to Maris's clinic in Coralie's ancient Subaru that smelled permanently of wet dog. The teenager had been told only that Dashiell needed additional testing, nothing about the suspicions forming in Maris's mind. She sat in the waiting room with Dashiell's carrier on her lap, her anxiety manifesting in the rapid bouncing of her knee until the receptionist called them back. Maris's clinic was a small, well-organized space that had been her father's before her. The examination room still had some of his old equipment, pieces he had used for decades and refused to replace as long as they remained functional. She had updated the technology where it mattered: digital X-ray, modern anesthesia equipment, comprehensive laboratory capabilities, but kept the soul of the place intact. Her father's philosophy had been that good medicine required both cutting-edge knowledge and old-fashioned attention, and she had never found reason to disagree. "This is going to require sedation," Maris explained as she prepared Dashiell for the procedure. "I need to get very detailed X-rays of his teeth and jaw, which means he needs to be completely still. He'll be a little groggy when he wakes up, but there's no significant risk." Isolde nodded, her hand resting on Dashiell's head. "Will it hurt?" "No, he won't feel anything. I promise I'll take good care of him." The sedation took effect quickly. Dashiell's amber eyes grew unfocused, then closed, his body relaxing completely as the medication did its work. Maris positioned him carefully under the X-ray machine, adjusting the angles to capture every detail of his dental structure. She took multiple images, more than would typically be necessary for a routine examination, building a comprehensive picture of what Dashiell's teeth could reveal about his true age. Teeth did not lie. Unlike body condition or behavior, which could be altered by circumstance and environment, teeth accumulated changes over time that were difficult to fake or misinterpret. The amount of wear on the surfaces, the condition of the roots, the degree of tartar accumulation, the state of the periodontal ligaments, all of these factors provided reliable aging information that was independent of how an animal had been treated. While Dashiell slept, Maris developed the X-rays and pulled them up on her computer, enlarging each image to study the finest details. She had a reference chart open on her second monitor, showing typical dental progression in domestic cats from infancy through old age. She compared Dashiell's X-rays against the expected patterns, checking and rechecking her findings because what she was seeing seemed impossible. His teeth showed minimal wear. The cusps of his premolars and molars were still relatively sharp, lacking the flattening that occurred with years of chewing. His tooth roots were long and healthy, showing none of the resorption common in older cats. The periodontal ligaments were thick and intact. The bone density around the teeth was excellent, and there was virtually no calculus buildup that would indicate years of inadequate dental care. Maris pulled up a specific reference image for cats aged 3 to 4 years. The match was nearly perfect. She sat back from the computer, her heart pounding with a combination of professional excitement and ethical concern. If these X-rays were correct, and she had no reason to doubt her ability to read them, then Dashiell was not a senior cat at all. He was barely past adolescence, young enough that his entire life should still be ahead of him, young enough that everything they had believed about him for nearly a year was categorically false. She returned to the examination room where Dashiell was beginning to wake from sedation, his movements uncoordinated and confused. Isolde had been allowed back and was sitting nearby, watching with the intense focus she reserved for moments when she felt helpless. Maris checked his vitals, ensured his recovery was progressing normally, and then made a decision. "Isolde, I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." The teenager's face went pale. "He's sick." "No, he's not sick, but I've discovered something significant." Maris pulled up the X-rays on the examination room's monitor. "These are Dashiell's teeth. Based on what I'm seeing here, combined with his blood work and physical examination, I believe we have been substantially wrong about his age." Isolde stared at the images without comprehension. "I don't understand. I don't think Dashiell is 12 years old. Based on all the evidence I've gathered, I believe he's approximately 3.5 years old. Maybe 4 at the most." The words hung in the air, impossible and absolute. Isolde's mouth opened, closed, opened again without producing sound. Dashiell, still groggy, let out a small confused meow that seemed to punctuate the revelation. "That's not possible," Isolde finally managed. "Look at him. He looks old. He acts old. He looks like a cat who was severely malnourished for an extended period," Maris corrected gently. "Chronic starvation, especially during crucial developmental stages, can cause premature aging of the coat and skin. It can create lethargy that mimics senior behavior. Combined with the psychological trauma of abandonment and stress, it's not surprising that he presented as much older than his actual age. But the shelter, Dr. Chen, everyone made a reasonable assumption based on limited information," Maris said. "This isn't about blame. It's about correcting a mistake now that we have better data." Isolde sank into the chair beside the examination table, her hands trembling. "What happens now?" "Now I call Coralie and show her this evidence. We'll need to update his records, change his information card, probably make some kind of public announcement since he's been featured so prominently as a senior adoption case." Maris paused, choosing her next words carefully. "This is going to be complicated, Isolde. The shelter has built a narrative around Dashiell, and changing it will raise questions about their credibility. But it's the truth," Isolde said fiercely, her protective instinct overriding her social anxiety. "Shouldn't the truth matter more?" "It should," Maris agreed. "But human institutions are messy things, and the truth doesn't always arrive conveniently." Dashiell was fully awake now, though still unsteady on his feet. He looked around the examination room with dilated pupils, trying to orient himself in space that felt simultaneously familiar and strange. Isolde reached for him instinctively, and he allowed her to gather him close, seeking stability in her arms while his world, in ways he could not yet understand, underwent a fundamental reshaping. Before we continue with the story, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support truly helps keep this channel alive and growing. The meeting in Coralie's office 3 hours later had the atmosphere of a crisis management session. Maris brought her laptop with the x-rays and blood work results. Coralie had pulled Dashiell's complete file, including the original intake photos that now seemed to tell a different story when viewed through the lens of new information. Beckett sat in the corner in a folding chair that creaked whenever he shifted his weight, present at Coralie's insistence because he had lived at the shelter longer than anyone and had insights born of careful observation. "Show me everything," Coralie said, her voice tight with the control required to manage competing emotions. Maris walked her through the evidence systematically, the blood work that showed markers inconsistent with senior age, the physical examination findings that revealed joint flexibility and muscle tone more typical of a young adult, and finally the dental x-rays that provided the most definitive proof. "This tooth here," Maris indicated, pointing to a specific molar on the screen. "In a 12-year-old cat, we would expect to see significant wear on this surface. The cusps would be flattened, the enamel thinned. Instead, look at the definition. This is a young tooth, maybe used hard during a period of inadequate nutrition but fundamentally young." Coralie studied the image, her expression unreadable. "Could you be wrong?" "Theoretically, yes, medicine is not infallible, but the evidence from multiple independent sources all points to the same conclusion. His age was overestimated, probably by about 8 or 9 years. 8 or 9 years, Coralie repeated slowly. "We've been telling people he's a senior cat for nearly 12 months. We've waived adoption fees, prioritized him for senior-specific programs, written fundraising appeals about giving him a comfortable retirement, and you're telling me he's actually in his prime? I understand the implications." "Do you?" Coralie's composure cracked slightly. "Do you understand that this makes us look incompetent at best, dishonest at worst? That every person who shared his story, every donor who gave money specifically for senior cat care, every potential adopter we told he only had a few years left, they were all operating on false information that we provided. We provided information we believed to be accurate at the time," Maris countered firmly. "Medical understanding evolves as we gather new data. That's not incompetence. That's science." Beckett cleared his throat, drawing attention to his corner of the room. "Seems to me," he said in his gravelly voice, "that you're both right. The question isn't who to blame, because blame doesn't change anything. The question is what you do now that you know." Coralie turned to look at him, and Maris saw the exhaustion in the shelter director's face, the weight of too many impossible decisions taking their toll. "What would you do?" Coralie asked. Beckett considered this carefully, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "I'd tell the truth, not because it's easy or convenient, but because the alternative is worse. You bury this, and it becomes a secret. Secrets have a way of coming out at the worst possible times, usually when someone else controls the narrative. You own it now, you control how people understand it." "He's right," Maris agreed. "We announce it as a discovery. Frame it as good news. This cat everyone fell in love with actually has his whole life ahead of him, instead of just a few years. We explain the medical reasons for the initial misassessment, show people the evidence, and be completely transparent about how this kind of mistake can happen, even with the best intentions." Coralie stood and walked to her window, looking out at the lavender fields where early spring growth was beginning to show. The farm's owner was already preparing for the summer season, planting new rows and repairing the irrigation system, life continuing in its cycles, indifferent to the small dramas of humans trying to do right by animals that depended on them. "People are going to say we're changing the story to make him more adoptable," she said quietly, "that we lied before and we're lying now." "Some people will say that," Maris acknowledged. "But most people, if we present the evidence clearly, will understand. And honestly, if this helps Dashiell get adopted by someone who can give him the next 10 or 12 years he deserves, isn't that worth the public relations challenge?" Coralie turned back to face them. "What about Soren's photographs? He's been planning that whole series about long-term residents, focusing on their dignity and value despite their age. This undermines the entire concept." Farzanmar Beckett interjected, "It becomes an even better story. Not just about valuing older animals, but about looking past our assumptions to see who's really there. That cat in Soren's photos doesn't look old because he isn't old. He looks like exactly what he is, a young cat who survived something hard enough to make him seem ancient. That's powerful, seems to me." Silence fell over the office, while they absorbed the implications of moving forward versus trying to maintain the previous narrative. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the shelter's evening routine, Volunteers saying goodbye to their favorite animals, the clatter of food bowls being washed, the distant barking of dogs settling in for the night. Maris closed her laptop, preparing to leave them to their decision. Whatever you choose, I need to update his medical records to reflect accurate information. As his veterinarian, I have an ethical obligation to document what I've found. I know, Coralie said, and you're right. We tell the truth. We deal with the consequences. She looked at Beckett. Can you spread the word to the regular volunteers? I want to tell them in person before this goes public. They deserve to hear it from me, not from social media. I'll make some calls, Beckett agreed, standing with the careful movements of someone whose body had accumulated its own history of wear. After they left, Coralie sat alone in her office and allowed herself 5 minutes of complete emotional honesty. She was angry at the circumstances, at the initial misassessment, at the timing that could not have been worse given their current funding crisis. She was afraid of the backlash, the damage to Riverbend's reputation, the potential loss of donor trust. But underneath those surface emotions was something else, something that felt suspiciously like relief, because the truth, however inconvenient, was also a gift. Dashiell had years ahead of him. He was not a senior cat in his twilight, but a young adult whose life had barely started. Whatever he had survived, and it must have been substantial to create such dramatic physical effects, he had survived with enough resilience left to build something better. That was worth fighting for. That was worth the complicated public explanations and the uncomfortable questions. They would tell Dashiell's real story, the whole story, and trust that people were capable of understanding that sometimes the truth was more complex and more beautiful than the simple narratives we constructed to make sense of a messy world. She pulled out her phone and composed a message to Soren. Need to talk, major development with Dashiell. Call me tonight. Then she began drafting the announcement that would reshape everything they thought they knew about the orange cat in cage 7, the one who had been waiting patiently for 1,053 days, not knowing that his entire identity was about to transform. The emergency volunteer meeting was held on Thursday evening after the shelter closed to the public. Coralie had arranged folding chairs in a semicircle, ordered pizza that sat mostly untouched on the table near the door, and rehearsed her speech enough times that the words had started to lose meaning. 18 people showed up, the core group who came weekly or more, the ones who had formed attachments to specific animals and took their commitment seriously. Isolde arrived first, as usual, positioning herself in the back row where she could observe without being observed. She had not told anyone else what Maris had discovered, honoring the veterinarian's request for discretion, but the knowledge sat heavy in her chest like something waiting to explode. She watched the other volunteers filter in, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of shared purpose, completely unaware that their understanding of one of Riverbend's most recognizable residents was about to be demolished. Soren came with his camera, assuming this was another promotional opportunity. He had been working on editing his photographs of Dashiell, planning a whole series that would tell the story of overlooked senior animals through striking visual imagery. He had already pitched the concept to a local magazine that featured human interest stories, and they had expressed genuine interest. When everyone was settled, Coralie stood at the front of the group, clutching note cards she had prepared but would ultimately ignore. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began. "I have some information to share that is significant, complicated, and ultimately good news, though it's going to raise questions that won't be easy to answer." She had their attention now, the casual conversations dying away to focused silence. "It concerns Dashiell, the orange and white cat many of you have gotten to know over the past year. We've been operating under the belief that he was a senior cat, approximately 12 years old, based on his condition when he arrived and the initial veterinary assessment. This week, Dr. Holloway conducted additional testing that has revealed something unexpected." She paused, making eye contact with several volunteers before continuing. "Dashiell is not 12 years old. Based on comprehensive dental x-rays and metabolic testing, Dr. Holloway has determined that he is approximately 3.5 years old." The reaction was immediate and varied. Several people looked confused, as if they had misheard. Others laughed nervously, assuming this was some kind of elaborate joke. Soren's face went through a rapid progression of emotions: disbelief, realization, and then something that looked like betrayal. "That's not possible," someone said. Look at him. He looks old. Coralie nodded, having anticipated this response. He looks like a cat who experienced severe malnutrition during crucial developmental stages. Dr. Holloway can explain the medical details better than I can, but essentially, his appearance and behavior were shaped by trauma and neglect, not by age. We made a reasonable assessment based on what we could observe, but we were wrong. How can you be sure the new assessment is correct? This came from Janet, a retired nurse who volunteered 3 days a week and approached everything with clinical skepticism. Couldn't the X-rays be misread? Dr. Holloway is very confident in her findings, and I've seen the evidence myself. She's willing to present it to anyone who wants to review it, and she'd welcome a second opinion from another veterinarian if that would help establish credibility. Soren stood up abruptly. Do you have any idea what this does to the project I've been working on? The entire concept was about senior animals deserving love and respect. Now you're telling me the cat at the center of it isn't even a senior. I understand your frustration. Do you? I pitched this story, I got interest from actual publications, and now the fundamental premise is false. That doesn't just affect me, Coralie. It affects Riverbend's reputation. People are going to think we're either incompetent or deliberately misleading them. The room erupted into overlapping conversations, volunteers expressing confusion, concern, and in some cases anger at having been given incorrect information that they had then shared with friends, family, and social media followers. Coralie let it run for a minute, understanding that people needed to voice their reactions before they could move past them. Then she raised her voice, not shouting but projecting with authority. I need everyone to listen. The room gradually quieted. Coralie took a breath, steadying herself. Everything you're feeling right now, the confusion, the frustration, the concern about credibility, I feel it too. This is not the situation any of us wanted. But here's what I know for certain. Dashiell is still the same cat he was yesterday. His personality hasn't changed. His need for a home hasn't changed. His value as a living being hasn't changed. The only thing that changed is our understanding of his story. She gestured toward the cat section, where Dashiell was undoubtedly listening to this entire conversation, picking up on the tension, even if he could not understand the words. We can view this as a disaster, or we can view it as an opportunity. Not just for Dashiell, but for every animal that gets overlooked because of assumptions we make based on incomplete information. How many times have we seen people pass by older animals, or animals that look rough, because they make calculations about worth and investment? Dashiell's story now becomes about looking deeper, about understanding that appearances can be deceiving, about giving second chances to beings that life has already been unfair to. Isolde stood up, surprising herself as much as anyone else. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, but steady. He's still the same cat I've been talking to every day for 6 months. Whether he's 3 or 12 doesn't change who he is or what he's been through. If anything, knowing he's young makes this better. He has more time, more possibility. Several volunteers nodded at this, the teenagers' simple logic cutting through the complexity of their adult concerns about reputation and narrative control. Soren sat back down, running his hands through his carefully styled hair. The photographs still work, he admitted reluctantly. Maybe even better, actually. The images captured something real. Survival, resilience, the cost of hardship. Those themes don't depend on his chronological age. Exactly, Coralie said, grateful for the shift. We tell the truth. We explain how this discovery happened, and we emphasize that it's good news. This cat that everyone has been rooting for, he has his whole life ahead of him now. That's a story worth telling. Janet, the skeptical nurse, raised her hand. What about the people who donated specifically for senior cat care? What do we tell them? We tell them their donations helped save a life, which was always the point. We offer them the option to redirect their contributions if they feel misled, though I hope most will understand that medical assessments can change as new information becomes available. The meeting continued for another hour, working through practical questions about how to announce the discovery, what to post on social media, how to handle media inquiries if the story gained traction beyond their local community. Coralie drafted language that emphasized transparency and positioned the revelation as a testament to thorough veterinary care, rather than an admission of failure. By the time people started leaving, the atmosphere had shifted from hostile confusion to cautious acceptance. They were still concerned, still worried about potential backlash, but they understood that moving forward with honesty was the only viable path. Isolde stayed after everyone else had gone, helping Coralie fold chairs and clean up the barely touched pizza. They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes before the teenager spoke. "Can I tell him?" Coralie looked up from stacking chairs. "Tell him what?" "That we know. That he's younger than we thought. That he has more time." Isolde's voice was very small. "I know it sounds stupid. He's a cat. He doesn't understand calendars or age or any of this. But I feel like he should know that something changed, that something got better." Coralie's expression softened. "Go ahead. I think he probably knows you better than any of us anyway." Isolde made her way to Dashiell's enclosure, where he was sitting in his usual position, alert, observant, waiting with the patience that had defined his entire stay at Riverbend. She opened the cage and sat on the floor beside it, and Dashiell emerged slowly, stretching before walking to her with deliberate steps. "Hey," Isolde said softly as he settled into her lap. "So, there's been some news. Turns out you're not old at all. You're young. You just had a really bad time that made you seem old." She stroked his head, feeling him lean into the touch. "That means you have years and years still. A whole life. And I know the past year here has been hard, but it's not going to be your whole story. It's just the middle part, the hard part, that makes the rest mean something." Dashiell purred, a rusty sound that suggested the mechanism was out of practice. Isolde felt tears prickling at her eyes but blinked them away. She had learned in therapy that crying was allowed, that emotions were data rather than weakness, but she still preferred to do it in private. "Someone is going to want you," she continued, more to convince herself than him. "Now that they know you're young, now that they understand you're not a medical risk waiting to happen, someone is going to see what I see, and it's going to be good. You're going to be happy." The words felt like both a promise and a prayer, thrust out into the universe in hope that speaking them might make them true. The announcement went live on Riverbend's social media account Saturday morning, carefully timed to coincide with peak engagement hours. Coralie had worked with Soren to select the perfect photograph, one of the striking images from his recent session with Dashiell, showing the orange cat in profile against the late afternoon light. His amber eyes were sharp and clear. His posture suggested coiled energy rather than elderly weariness, and even someone with no veterinary expertise could sense the vitality in the image. The caption read, "Exciting update about Dashiell. Sometimes in rescue work, we discover that the stories we've been telling need revision as we learn new information." Dashiell, who many of you have followed as a senior cat, recently underwent comprehensive veterinary testing that revealed a surprising truth. He is not 12 years old as initially assessed, but approximately 3.5 years old. This assessment came from dental x-rays, blood work, and thorough physical examination conducted by Dr. Maris Holloway, who noticed inconsistencies during routine care. Dashiell's aged appearance resulted from severe malnutrition and stress during his early life, conditions that can prematurely age a cat's coat and behavior. We take full responsibility for the initial misassessment and are grateful for the thorough medical care that revealed the truth. This means Dashiell has his entire life ahead of him, not just a few comfortable retirement years, but potentially 12 to 15 more years of companionship. His story is now about resilience, survival, and the danger of making assumptions based on appearance alone. He is still the same wonderful, patient, loving cat we've all come to know. He still desperately needs a home. If you or someone you know has been considering adopting Dashiell, please understand that you wouldn't be taking on a senior with limited time. You'd be gaining a young adult cat with everything to give and years to give it. For those who donated specifically for senior cat care, thank you. Your contributions helped provide the medical attention that revealed this truth. Contact us if you have questions or concerns. We believe in radical transparency and are committed to earning back any trust this situation may have compromised. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, the post had hundreds of reactions, dozens of shares, and a comment section that rapidly filled with perspectives ranging from supportive to suspicious. This is wonderful news. So happy he has his whole life ahead of him. How do you mistake a 3-year-old cat for a 12-year-old? This seems like a serious competency issue. My cat looked ancient after she was found as a stray. After a few months of good care, she looked like a kitten again. This happens more than people think. Are you changing the story to make him more adoptable? This feels convenient. I shared his story as a senior cat to all my friends. Now I look like an idiot. The important thing is, the truth came out. Well done for being transparent. Can you share the x-rays? I'd like to see the evidence. Coralie monitored the responses from her office, her stomach churning with each notification. The supportive comments outnumbered the critical ones, but the critical ones cut deeper, hitting precisely the fears she had been harboring about how this would be received. She had prepared herself for backlash, but underestimated how personal it would feel when it arrived. Maris called mid-morning. "I've been following the post. Are you okay?" "I will be," Coralie said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "It's a mixed response so far. I can post the x-rays and blood work results if you think it would help establish credibility. I'll need to redact any identifying information, but the core data can be shared. Do it. The more transparent we are, the better." By afternoon, Maris had added her own post to her veterinary clinic's page, providing a detailed medical explanation with annotated x-rays showing the specific markers that indicated Dashiell's true age. She included comparison images from reference materials, breaking down the science in accessible language that respected her audience's intelligence while not assuming specialized knowledge. As the veterinarian who made this discovery, I want to explain exactly what I found and why I'm confident in this revised assessment. Aging cats is part art and part science, relying on multiple data points including dental wear, blood chemistry, physical examination, and clinical experience. Initial assessments are often made under less than ideal circumstances, with limited information and time constraints. This is especially true for shelter animals who arrive in poor condition. Dashiell presented with characteristics that reasonably suggested senior status: dull coat, low body weight, lethargy, and overall appearance of a cat who had lived a hard life. However, as he received consistent care and nutrition, I began noticing inconsistencies that prompted more thorough testing. The dental x-rays were definitive. Young cats have teeth with sharp cusps, long root structures, and minimal wear patterns. Senior cats show flattened cusps, shorter roots due to resorption, and significant accumulation of dental calculus. Dashiell's teeth clearly match the young adult profile. His blood work further supports this, showing metabolic markers inconsistent with senior age. This is not a matter of opinion, but of objective medical evidence. I have included images here for other veterinarians or anyone with medical training to review. I welcome questions and constructive discussion about the assessment methodology. What happened to Dashiell early in his life was severe enough to create the appearance of premature aging, but his actual chronological age is young. This is ultimately good news for a cat who deserves every chance at happiness. The veterinarian's post helped shift the narrative. Other professionals in the comments section weighed in with their own experiences of cases where malnutrition or trauma had substantially affected animal appearance. A veterinary dentist from Portland offered to provide a third opinion if needed, validating Maris's findings based on the shared images. The tide of public opinion began to turn from skepticism towards acceptance. By Sunday, the story had been picked up by a local news blog that specialized in human interest features. The article was generally positive, framing the discovery as an uplifting example of thorough veterinary care, revealing unexpected good news. The reporter interviewed Coralie and Maris, quoted liberally from their social media posts, and included several of Soren's striking photographs. The piece ended with information about how to adopt Dashiell and a reminder that many shelter animals were overlooked due to assumptions that might not withstand careful scrutiny. The article generated its own wave of attention. Riverbend's website experienced more traffic in 24 hours than it typically saw in a month. Calls came in from people interested in Dashiell specifically, as well as general inquiries about other available animals. The shelter's Instagram following grew by several hundred accounts. The voicemail filled with messages ranging from adoption inquiries to interview requests from larger media outlets to a few angry tirades from people convinced this was all an elaborate hoax. Coralie barely slept Sunday night, her mind spinning through contingency plans and worst-case scenarios. What if someone sued, claiming they had been defrauded into donating for senior cat care? What if the state licensing board decided this reflected poorly enough on Riverbend's veterinary protocols to warrant investigation? What if this became the story that defined the shelter, overshadowing all the good work they did? But when she arrived Monday morning, exhausted and anxious, she found Beckett waiting in her office with fresh coffee and his characteristic calm presence. "You look like hell," he observed without malice. "I feel like hell." "Well, stop it. You told the truth, dealt with the consequences, and Dashiell's probably going to get adopted because of it. That's called winning, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. 5 people called over the weekend threatening to report us for fraud. 5 people out of how many who saw the post? Couple thousand?" Beckett settled into his usual corner chair. "There's always going to be some folks who need to be angry about something. Don't let them take up more space in your head than they deserve." Coralie took a long sip of the coffee, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "I'm scared we damaged the shelter's reputation permanently. Maybe. Or maybe you made it stronger by showing you care more about doing right than looking right. People respect that deep down. Not all people, not immediately, but the ones who matter. They get it." Movement in the doorway made them both look up. Isolde stood there unusually early for a Monday, holding her phone with a strange expression on her face. "You need to see this," she said, walking in and pulling up an email on her screen. "It came in last night." Coralie took the phone and read the message. "My name is Thane Carmody. I'm a carpenter here in town. I've been visiting Riverbend occasionally over the past few months, mostly just walking through and thinking about maybe adopting a cat. I kept noticing Dashiell, the orange one, but I talked myself out of it every time, because I'm 52 and still dealing with losing my wife 2 years ago, and I figured taking on a senior cat was more responsibility than I could handle given everything else. Then I saw your posts this weekend about his real age. I've spent the last 2 days thinking about what that means, not just for him, but for me. I've been using his age as an excuse not to risk getting attached to something I'd have to lose again soon. Finding out he's young takes away that excuse. If you're willing, I'd like to come meet him properly, not just walk past his cage, but actually spend time with him and see if we might be good for each other. I'm not promising I'll adopt him. I'm just promising I'll stop making assumptions about what I can't handle, and actually try. Let me know when would be a good time. Thank you for being honest about the mistake. That took guts." Coralie read the email twice, then looked up at Isolde with something that felt dangerously close to hope. "I remember him," Isolde said quietly. "Tall guy, graying hair, usually comes alone on Sunday afternoons. He always stopped at Dashiell's cage but never stayed long. I thought he was just killing time. When did he send this?" "Last night, 11:37. I just saw it this morning when I checked the shelter email." Beckett made a sound that might have been satisfaction. "See? Truth has consequences. Sometimes they're even good ones." Coralie composed a response immediately, suggesting Tuesday afternoon when the shelter would be quiet, and Thane could have unhurried time with Dashiell. She sent it before she could second-guess the phrasing, then sat back in her chair and allowed herself the first full breath she'd taken in days. "This doesn't fix everything," she said, more to herself than the others. "Nothing ever does," Beckett agreed, "but it's something, and sometimes something is enough." Thane Carmody arrived at Riverbend on Tuesday at 2 o'clock exactly, the kind of punctuality that suggested someone who had been watching the clock for hours beforehand. He was tall, like Isolde remembered, with a lean build that came from physical labor rather than gym membership. His hands were rough with calluses, marked by small scars accumulated over decades of working with wood and tools. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, and he carried with him the faint smell of sawdust that never quite washed out. Coralie met him at the entrance, extending her hand in greeting. "Mr. Carmody, thank you for coming." "Thane," he corrected, shaking her hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive. "And thank you for responding to my email. I wasn't sure if you would, given everything going on." "Your timing was actually perfect," Coralie admitted, leading him inside. "We needed a reminder that sometimes honesty opens doors instead of closing them." The shelter was quiet at this hour, the chaos of weekend adoption events replaced by the peaceful routine of midday. A few cats dozed in sunbeams, several dogs lounged in their enclosures, and the whole building hummed with the low-key energy of animals comfortable in their temporary home, even while waiting for permanent ones. Dashiell was awake in his enclosure, sitting in his characteristic position with perfect posture and watchful amber eyes. He tracked their approach with the kind of attention that suggested he understood something significant was happening, even if he could not articulate what. "This is Dashiell," Coralie said, though the introduction was unnecessary given the amount of time Thane had spent observing this particular cat over recent months. "Hey there," Thane said softly, crouching down to be at eye level with the cage. "I've seen you before, always meant to stop properly, but I kept making excuses." Dashiell stood and walked to the front of his enclosure, studying this human who spoke to him with unusual directness. There was something in Thane's voice, a quality of matching brokenness that Dashiell recognized instinctively. This was a person who had survived something that left marks, just as he had. "Can I hold him?" Thane asked. "Of course." Coralie opened the cage, and Dashiell stepped out willingly, walking directly to Thane with none of his usual caution. It was as if he had been waiting specifically for this person, this moment, this opportunity to demonstrate that connection was not just possible, but inevitable when the right circumstances aligned. Thane gathered the orange cat carefully, supporting his weight with practiced competence. Dashiell settled against his chest, his purr starting as a faint rumble that grew stronger as Thane's hand began stroking along his spine. "He likes you," Coralie observed. "He's usually more reserved with strangers." "Maybe he knows," Thane said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying unsuccessfully to hide. "Maybe he can tell we're both working on the same problem, figuring out how to trust again after everything that made trust feel dangerous." They moved to the shelter's small visitation room, a space designed for potential adopters to spend quality time with animals away from the noise and stimulation of the main area. It contained a comfortable chair, some toys, a scratching post, and a window that looked out onto the lavender fields where the plants were finally beginning to show their first purple blooms. Thane sat in the chair with Dashiell still on his lap, and Coralie tactfully left them alone, closing the door behind her with a quiet click that said, "This is your time." For several minutes, neither human nor cat moved. They simply existed together in shared space, adjusting to each other's presence. Dashiell kneaded Thane's leg gently with his front paws, his claws barely extending, a gesture that was part comfort-seeking and part affection. Thane's hand continued its rhythmic stroking, and gradually his breathing slowed to match the cat's, their bodies synchronizing in the way that happens when two living creatures decide, consciously or not, to trust each other. "I wasn't going to come," Thane said eventually, speaking to Dashiell in a low voice that seemed to bypass his conscious filters. "When I saw your first posts when I thought you were old, I told myself it wouldn't be fair. To you having to adjust to someone new for just a couple years. To me, having to lose someone else so soon after." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish that sentence. Dashiell bumped his head against Thane's chest, a gentle insistence that pulled the man back from wherever dark place his thoughts had wandered. "My wife Sarah died 2 years ago. Cancer. We had 9 months from diagnosis to the end, which was both way too long and not nearly enough time." Thane's hand had stilled on Dashiell's fur, but started moving again when the cat made a small sound of encouragement. "We never had kids, never had pets. We kept saying we would after we bought a house, after we got the business more stable, after 1,000 other afters that never came. And then suddenly there was no after anymore. Just before, during, and the endless stretch of silence after she was gone." Dashiell turned in Thane's lap to face him more directly, his amber eyes fixed on the man's face with that uncanny feline intensity that seems to see past the surface presentation into something deeper. "People kept telling me to get a dog or a cat, said it would help with the loneliness, but I couldn't do it. Because getting a pet means accepting that you're going to keep living. You're going to build a routine that doesn't include the person who died. You're going to care about something new instead of just maintaining this perfect frozen memorial to everything you lost." He wiped at his eyes with his free hand, not quite crying, but close. "And when I finally thought maybe I could do it, when I started coming here and saw you in your cage, I convinced myself you were too old, that I'd just be setting myself up for more grief." Dashiell placed his paw on Thane's chest, right over his heart, applying gentle pressure that was either coincidence or intention, depending on how much agency one was willing to grant a cat's behavior. "Then I found out you're not old at all, that you're young and you have all this time ahead of you, and suddenly my excuse evaporated. Because the truth is, I'm not afraid of you dying. I'm afraid of you living, of having to show up every day and take care of something that depends on me, of having to be present and accountable and not just this ghost moving through rooms that used to mean something." The confession hung in the air, raw and honest in a way Thane probably could not have managed with another human being. But Dashiell was not human, and the safety of speaking to something that would not judge or respond with awkward reassurances created space for truth that had been building pressure for 2 years. "I'm a mess," Thane said with a sound that was half laugh, half sob. You deserve better than someone who can't even decide if he wants to keep waking up most mornings. Dashiell purred louder, a sound that filled the small room and vibrated against Thane's chest, where his paw still rested. It was the same purr he had given Isolde when she broke down one afternoon about her anxiety, the same purr he had offered to Beckett after the old man had mentioned his estranged children, the same purr he had used countless times when humans needed something from him that they could not name. The thing is, Thane continued, his voice steadier now, I think maybe that's exactly why we might work, because you're a mess too, in your own way. You survived something that made people think you were old and broken, but you're not, you're just waiting. Waiting for someone to see past the damage to what's actually there. He lifted Dashiell slightly, bringing them face to face. So, here's my proposal. I'm going to come visit you every day this week. We're going to spend time together and figure out if this is real or if I'm just projecting my own stuff onto a cat that probably just wants someone with a stable home and regular feeding schedule. And if at the end of the week we both still feel like this makes sense, then I'm going to take you home. Not because I have my life figured out, but because maybe figuring it out is easier when you're not doing it alone. Dashiell responded by headbutting Thane's face with enough force to be emphatic but not aggressive, his version of sealing the agreement. When Coralie checked on them 20 minutes later, she found Thane sitting in the chair with Dashiell draped across his lap, both of them apparently asleep. The afternoon light coming through the window made the scene look like something from a painting. Man and cat, both worn by their respective survivals, finding in each other's presence the possibility of rest. She quietly closed the door and returned to her office, where she pulled up Dashiell's file and added a note. Potential adopter Thane Carmody. Connection seems genuine and deep. Proceeding with week-long visit schedule before final decision. Feels promising. Feels promising. 2 words that carried the weight of 11 months of waiting, of a discovery that had threatened to undermine everything they had built, of a truth that turned out to be more gift than catastrophe. Feels promising was enough. Thane kept his promise, arriving every afternoon that week at 2 o'clock with the reliability of someone whose woodshop operated on his own schedule. Each visit lasted an hour or longer, time spent mostly in quiet companionship, with occasional conversation that was more Thane processing his thoughts aloud than dialogue. Dashiell proved himself an excellent listener, responding at appropriate moments with chirps or head bumps, but never demanding more interaction than Thane seemed capable of providing. Isolde watched these visits from a careful distance, protective of the cat she had come to consider her special project, but recognizing that her role was changing from primary support to transition facilitator. She and Thane spoke briefly each day, usually just pleasantries, but on Thursday afternoon he sought her out specifically. You spend a lot of time with him, Thane observed. It was not quite a question, but carried implicit request for information. Yeah, Isolde confirmed. He's been my favorite since I started volunteering here. I talk to him about things I can't talk to other people about. Thane nodded, understanding the statement at a level deeper than its surface meaning. Has he always been this calm, this comfortable with people? No. When he first arrived, he was shut down. He'd let you handle him, but it was like he wasn't really there, you know, just tolerating what was happening. It took months before he started engaging. She paused, choosing her words carefully. He's choosy about who gets the real version of him. Most people just see the polite surface, but some people, like you, I think, he recognizes something in. What does he recognize? Isolde considered this seriously. That you're not going to pretend everything is fine when it's not. That you'll be honest about the hard stuff. He spent his whole life, or at least the parts that mattered, with people who lied, who said they'd take care of him and then didn't, who made promises they had no intention of keeping. I think he can tell the difference now between people who perform caring and people who actually feel it, even when the feeling is complicated. Thane was quiet for a long moment, then, if I adopt him, will you still visit? Do you want me to? I think he'd want you to, and honestly, it might help me too, having someone who knows him, who can tell me if I'm screwing up. He tried for humor, but the anxiety underneath was obvious. You won't screw up, Isolde said with the confidence of someone whose therapeutic journey had taught her to recognize authentic intention. You'll make mistakes, probably, because everybody does, but you'll fix them. That's the difference. Friday afternoon, Thane arrived with a cat carrier, not the cardboard one the shelter provided, but a proper hard-sided carrier with good ventilation and a soft blanket inside. The symbolic weight of this preparation was not lost on anyone present. "I'd like to take him home," Thane told Coralie in her office, his hands clasped together to keep them from shaking. "If that's still possible, if you think it's the right thing." Coralie had been preparing for this moment all week. Documentation ready, adoption fee waived as it had been from the beginning, but now for different reasons. She pulled out the standard forms and walked Thane through each requirement, giving him multiple opportunities to reconsider or ask questions. "He'll need regular vet care," she emphasized. "Not because he's a senior anymore, but because all cats do. Annual checkups, vaccinations, dental cleaning eventually." "I have a vet," Thane assured her. "Well, I mean, I don't currently have pets, but I've identified one. Dr. Holloway, actually. I called her office earlier this week, and they said she takes new clients." "That's perfect. She knows his history better than anyone." Coralie paused over the final form, the one that transferred ownership and responsibility. "Thane, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." He looked up from the paperwork, meeting her eyes directly. "Are you ready for this? Not theoretically, not aspirationally, but actually ready to have a living creature depend on you every single day, even on the days when you can barely function yourself?" The question would have seemed harsh if not for the genuine concern in her voice. The recognition that this adoption needed to succeed, not just for Dashiell's sake, but for Thane's. "I don't know," Thane answered honestly. "I can't promise I'm ready, but I can promise I'm willing to try, and that I won't give up on him even when it's hard. I've learned some things about myself these past 2 years. I'm more resilient than I thought, and I'm more broken than I pretended. Dashiell deserves someone who's figured everything out, but that person doesn't exist. What exists is me, right now, with all my damage and uncertainty, genuinely wanting to give him the life he should have had all along. If that's not enough, I understand. But it's all I've got to offer." Coralie studied him for a long moment, her director's instincts weighing dozens of factors simultaneously: his body language, his response pattern over the week, his willingness to be vulnerable, his practical preparations. Then she pushed the final form across the desk. "Sign here," she said simply. "He's yours." The actual transfer happened in the main room, with an audience of volunteers who had gathered without being summoned, their collective intuition recognizing a significant moment. Isolde carried Dashiell from his enclosure one last time, holding him close and whispering something no one else could hear, before placing him gently in Thane's arms. Dashiell looked around the shelter space as if seeing it fresh, his amber eyes taking in the rows of enclosures, the other cats in various stages of their own waiting, the windows where light streamed across floors he had walked 1,074 times. His expression was impossible to read. Was it relief, sadness, fear, hope? Perhaps all of those, the complex emotional landscape of transition that humans labeled as progress, but felt in the moment like free fall. Thane carried him to the carrier and set him inside carefully, his hands gentle but assured. Dashiell circled once on the blanket, then settled into a loaf position facing forward, ready for whatever came next, even if he could not imagine what that might look like. "Take care of him," Isolde said, her voice thick with tears she was not bothering to hide. "He's special." "I know," Thane replied. "I'll send you updates, pictures, probably too many pictures, and you can visit whenever you want." "I'll take you up on that." Beckett appeared from wherever he'd been observing, producing a small bag that clinked suspiciously. "Toys," he explained gruffly. Figured he should have something familiar in the new place, plus his blanket. He pulled out the grey fabric with yellow stars that Dashiell had been needing for months. "Don't wash it yet. Smells like here, like what he knows. Give him time to adjust before you erase all the old scent markers." Thane accepted these offerings with visible emotion. "Thank you, for taking care of him, for not giving up on him." "We didn't do anything special," Coralie said. "We just saw him. That's all any of us need, really. To be seen." The goodbye stretched out longer than necessary because goodbyes always did, especially the ones that felt simultaneously like endings and beginnings. Eventually, Thane lifted the carrier, made his final thank yous, and walked out the door into the spring afternoon, where the lavender fields were reaching their first bloom and filling the air with that distinctive fragrance that meant renewal. Dashiell's enclosure stood empty for the first time in 11 months. Isolde stood staring at it, feeling the strange, hollow sensation of successful completion, like finishing a book that had consumed her attention, and now left her unsure of what to do with the suddenly available mental space. "You okay?" Coralie asked gently. "Yeah," Isolde said and meant it. "It's good. This is good. He gets to go home." Home. That word that meant safety, permanence, belonging. Dashiell was going home. Not to the one he had lost, but to a new one built on different foundations. A home with someone equally uncertain about the future, but willing to face it anyway. A home where both cat and human would learn what it meant to trust again, to care again, to believe that life could offer second chapters that did not simply repeat the pain of the first. In the carrier on the passenger seat of Thane's truck, Dashiell felt the engine vibrate to life beneath him. The movement was unfamiliar and slightly frightening, but Thane's voice came through clearly. "We're going to be okay, both of us. It won't be perfect, but it'll be real, and that's better anyway." The truck pulled away from Riverbend, leaving behind the only home Dashiell had known for almost a year. But homes were not really about buildings or enclosures. They were about the people who saw you, who understood that your damage was part of your story but not the whole story, who committed to the messy work of coexistence even when it was inconvenient or difficult or required more patience than anyone thought they possessed. Dashiell settled into his blanket as the truck navigated familiar roads toward an unfamiliar destination, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, allowed himself to hope that this time, finally, he was going somewhere he could stay. Thane's house was a small craftsman bungalow on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees that created a canopy of green overhead. The structure showed signs of meticulous care: fresh paint, well-maintained porch, gardens that were beginning their spring emergence. The woodshop occupied a detached garage at the back of the property, its windows showing glimpses of organized tools and half-finished projects waiting for attention. He carried Dashiell's carrier through the front door into a living room that was clean but sparse, decorated with the kind of minimal furniture that suggested someone who had stopped caring about domestic aesthetics somewhere along the way. A couch, a coffee table, a bookshelf with more empty space than books. Pictures on the mantel showed a younger Thane with a woman who must have been Sarah, both of them smiling at a beach somewhere, at a wedding, at various unremarkable moments that became precious only in retrospect. "Welcome home," Thane said, setting the carrier down on the living room floor and opening its door. "You can come out when you're ready. No pressure." Dashiell remained in the carrier for several minutes, his eyes adjusting to the new environment, while his other senses catalogued information. The house smelled of wood polish, coffee, and something faintly floral that might have been Sarah's perfume still lingering in the fabrics and furniture. It was quiet in a different way than the shelter. No other animals, no volunteer voices, just the ambient sounds of a residential neighborhood in late afternoon. Eventually, he emerged slowly, his body low to the ground in the instinctive posture of a cat, entering unfamiliar territory where threats might hide. He moved along the edges of the room, rubbing his face against furniture corners to mark them with his scent, claiming this space as his through the ancient feline ritual of scent distribution. Thane watched this process without interference, sitting on the couch and letting Dashiell set the pace. He had done research during the week, read articles about cat behavior, watched videos about introducing cats to new homes, consulted with Maris about what to expect. He understood intellectually that this transition would take time, that Dashiell would need to explore and establish safe spaces before he could relax into his new life. But knowing something intellectually was different from experiencing it emotionally. Watching Dashiell slink cautiously around the room, Thane felt a wave of doubt. Had he made a mistake? Was he really capable of providing what this cat needed? What if Dashiell decided this house was not safe, that Thane was not trustworthy, that the shelter had actually been better than this well-meaning but inadequate alternative? As if sensing these spiraling thoughts, Dashiell paused in his exploration and looked directly at Thane. The amber eyes held something that might have been reassurance or might have been simple acknowledgement. Then he jumped onto the couch, not onto Thane's lap, but beside him, maintaining a foot of distance but clearly choosing proximity over continued wariness. "Okay," Thane said softly. "Okay, we can do this." He showed Dashiell the essentials that evening: food and water bowls in the kitchen, litter box in the bathroom, a cat bed he'd purchased that Dashiell immediately ignored in favor of the couch. Thane had bought toys too, though he felt self-conscious deploying them, unsure if Dashiell was a cat who played or if trauma had stolen that capacity. Night fell, and the house grew dark, except for lamps Thane left on in strategic locations. He prepared himself for bed in the bathroom, brushing his teeth while Dashiell watched from the doorway with disconcerting intensity. The bedroom was upstairs, a space Thane had been avoiding since Sarah's death except for sleeping. He had been living most of his life in the downstairs rooms, treating the second floor like a museum of the past that he visited only out of necessity. "You can sleep wherever you want," Thane told Dashiell. "The bed, the couch, anywhere you feel safe." He climbed the stairs alone, expecting the cat to remain downstairs in the more familiar territory. But when he settled into bed, Sarah's side still untouched, her nightstand still holding the book she'd been reading when she got too sick to focus on words, he heard the soft sound of paws on the staircase. Dashiell appeared in the doorway, his orange and white form barely visible in the low light. He approached the bed cautiously, then jumped up with a grace that belied his months of shelter confinement. But instead of settling immediately, he walked across the comforter to Sarah's pillow, circled it once, then moved to Thane's side and settled against his leg. The gesture was deliberate, checking the absent person's space first, acknowledging the ghost that lived in this house, then choosing the living presence over the memory. Thane felt something break open in his chest, a pressure that had been building for 2 years, suddenly finding release. "She would have liked you," he whispered into the darkness. "She was always the one who wanted pets. I was the one making excuses about time and responsibility and all the logical reasons not to commit to caring for something." His hand found Dashiell's fur, stroking gently. "Turns out I was just scared. Scared of caring about anything too much because losing things you care about is the worst pain there is." "But you already know that, don't you?" Dashiell purred in response, the sound filling the quiet bedroom with vibration that felt almost like company, almost like the house was less empty than it had been for 730 days. They slept like that, not cuddled in the way of some cats and their humans, but connected, each aware of the other's breathing and presence. When Thane woke at 3 in the morning, his first thought was not the usual spiral of grief and regret, but simply, "The cat is here," and then, "I need to make sure he's okay." Small shifts, barely noticeable, but shifts nonetheless. The beginning of new patterns that would eventually replace old ones, not erasing them but adding to them, complicating the narrative in ways that made forward motion possible. Morning came with spring light filtering through curtains Thane had kept closed for months. Dashiell was awake first, sitting at the bedroom window and watching birds in the oak tree outside, with the focused intensity of a predator who had no intention of hunting but enjoyed the theoretical possibility. Thane lay in bed watching him, marveling at the simple domesticity of the scene. A cat in a window, morning light, the promise of coffee downstairs, and a day that needed living through. "Breakfast?" he suggested, and Dashiell immediately jumped down from the window to follow him downstairs, as if they had been performing this routine for years, rather than hours. Over the next several days, they established patterns that became rituals. Thane woke early, fed Dashiell, made coffee, and spent an hour in his woodshop while the cat explored the backyard under supervision. Mid-morning meant email and administrative work for Thane's carpentry business, while Dashiell claimed the sunny spot on the couch. Lunch was simple, usually shared in comfortable silence with Dashiell nearby, but not demanding attention. Afternoons varied. Sometimes Thane worked on projects. Sometimes he took walks that Dashiell observed from windows. Sometimes he simply sat and read or stared at walls, in the way of people still learning how to occupy their own lives. Evenings were when they came together most completely. Thane would cook something basic, Dashiell would supervise from a kitchen chair, and they would end the day on the couch with television neither of them really watched. Dashiell would knead Thane's leg, purring with an intensity that suggested relief at having finally found stability, and Thane would stroke his fur while processing the strange experience of having a living creature depend on his continued functioning. Isolde visited on Sunday afternoon as promised. Thane answered the door looking better than he had at the shelter. Rested, perhaps, or at least less actively exhausted. Dashiell appeared immediately at the sound of her voice, weaving between Thane's legs to greet her with obvious pleasure. "He looks good," Isolde observed, crouching down to offer proper hello scratches. "You both do, actually." "It's been an adjustment," Thane admitted, leading her inside. "But a good one, I think. He's been patient with me figuring things out." They sat in the living room and talked for an hour, comparing notes on Dashiell's behavior and preferences, Isolde sharing stories from his shelter days that Thane had not heard. At some point, the conversation shifted from the cat to their own experiences, Isolde talking about her anxiety and how working at Riverbend had helped her develop social skills she could slowly transfer to other contexts. Thane discussing his grief work and the therapy that had helped but not cured. "It's weird," Isolde said eventually. "He was the one who needed rescuing, but I think he rescued me too. Like, having something to focus on besides my own mess made the mess smaller somehow." "Yeah," Thane agreed, watching Dashiell doze in his patch of sunlight. "I know exactly what you mean." When Isolde left, Thane felt the strange satisfaction of having successfully completed a social interaction that would have felt impossible a month ago. He was engaging with the world again, in small ways, because Dashiell's presence demanded it. The cat needed food, which meant grocery shopping. He needed vet visits, which meant scheduling and keeping appointments. He needed environmental enrichment, which meant Thane had to think about what would make the house more interesting and comfortable. These were small demands, manageable ones, but they created structure around which Thane could rebuild his life. Not the life he'd had before Sarah's death, but a different one, shaped by different needs and possibilities. 3 weeks into Dashiell's residency in the Craftsman bungalow, Maris Holloway conducted a house call for his first official veterinary visit as a member of the Carmody household. She arrived with her portable equipment and professional demeanor, but her eyes were warm when Thane opened the door. "How's he adjusting?" she asked, following him inside. "Really well, I think. Come see." Dashiell was in his favorite window spot, sprawled in the sun with the boneless contentment of a cat who had found his place. He opened one eye as they approached, assessed that Maris was not an immediate threat, and returned to his nap. "He looks completely different," Maris observed, professional assessment already in progress. "His coat has more shine, his body language is relaxed, and he's clearly gained weight. Healthy weight, I mean, not concerning weight." She conducted a thorough examination right there on the living room floor, Dashiell tolerating it, with the patience of someone who had learned that veterinary attention, while annoying, was temporary and not malicious. His vitals were excellent, his teeth remained in good condition, and his overall physical status supported everything Maris had argued about his true age. "He's thriving," she concluded. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." "Mostly I'm just showing up," Thane said honestly. "He does the rest." Maris packed away her equipment but lingered, accepting Thane's offer of coffee and settling at the kitchen table with the ease of someone whose professional relationship was evolving into friendship. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. "Sure. That night you emailed about adopting him, you mentioned losing your wife. I'm sorry, by the way. That must have been devastating." "It was. It still is, honestly. But it's different now. Less sharp. More like a permanent ache instead of an acute injury." Maris nodded, understanding. "My father died last year. Heart attack, completely sudden. We ran the clinic together and I thought I had more time to learn everything he knew. But time doesn't wait for us to be ready. No, it doesn't. The thing I've noticed," Maris continued, "is that the grief becomes part of your operating system instead of this separate thing that interrupts normal function. It's always there, but you learn to work around it, with it. Having Dashiell seems like it's helping with that for you. He gives me a reason to keep the curtains open," Thane said simply. "That sounds like such a small thing, but it's not. For the past 2 years, I've been living in this dark cave I built around myself. Dashiell needs light, so I open the curtains. And once they're open, it's harder to justify closing them again." They talked for another hour, ranging across topics that had nothing to do with cats or veterinary medicine, but everything to do with how humans navigated loss and tried to construct meaningful lives afterward. By the time Maris left, Thane felt like he'd made his second friend in the span of a month. Not a replacement for what he'd lost, but an expansion of what remained. That evening, he took Dashiell out to the woodshop for the first time. He had been hesitant to introduce the cat to this space, worried about safety issues with tools and sawdust, but Dashiell had been showing increasing interest in the detached garage where mysterious activities happened daily. "Okay, new rules," Thane announced, as Dashiell investigated every corner with systematic thoroughness. "You can be out here with me, but you stay on this shelf where I can see you, away from anything dangerous. No investigating the saw, no batting at hanging tools, no climbing into workbenches full of sharp objects." He lifted Dashiell onto a designated shelf that he'd cleared and padded with an old sweater. Dashiell settled immediately, apparently content to supervise rather than interfere. Thane returned to his current project, a custom bookshelf commissioned by a client in Portland, and lost himself in the familiar rhythm of measuring, cutting, sanding. He worked with Dashiell watching for 2 hours, occasionally glancing up to ensure the cat remained in his safe zone. But Dashiell never moved from the shelf, perfectly content to observe the creative process. There was something profound about having a witness to his work, even a non-human one. For 2 years, Thane had been moving through his life without anyone noticing, working alone, eating alone, existing in a vacuum of attention. Dashiell's presence, his watchful eyes tracking Thane's movements, created accountability and purpose that had been missing. "You know what I'm realizing?" Thane said, setting down his sandpaper and looking directly at his cat. "I think maybe we saved each other. The shelter people probably think I rescued you, but that's not quite right. You needed a home, sure, but I needed a reason to believe I could still take care of something, that I wasn't just this broken mess who'd lost the ability to function normally. You've been trusting me with your safety, and that trust is making me trustworthy again. Does that make sense?" Dashiell chirped, a small sound that Thane had learned meant acknowledgement or contentment, or sometimes just, "I hear you, and I'm still here." "Yeah," Thane said. "I thought it might." The bookshelf took shape over the next several evenings, Dashiell present for each session. Thane found himself talking more as he worked, narrating his process and decision-making in ways he never had before. The cat was an excellent audience, attentive but uncritical, present but undemanding. In Dashiell's company, Thane could practice being the version of himself he was trying to become, functional, engaged, capable of creating things that mattered. When the bookshelf was finally complete, a beautiful piece in cherry wood with hand-cut dovetail joints and a finish that glowed in the workshop's overhead lights, Thane felt a surge of satisfaction that had been absent from his work for longer than he cared to admit. He had built this. He had stayed focused, made good decisions, created something of value. And Dashiell had been there for all of it, a silent partner in the reconstruction of a life that had seemed irreparably damaged. "We should celebrate," Thane announced. "What do you think? Fancy feast for you, decent wine for me?" Dashiell's response was to jump down from his shelf and wind between Thane's legs, purring loudly enough to be heard over the shop's ambient noise. That night, Thane opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to arrive, heated up a legitimate dinner instead of his usual simple fare, and treated Dashiell to wet food that was advertised as gourmet. They ate in the kitchen together, Thane at the table and Dashiell at his bowl, and the simple domesticity of the scene felt revolutionary. Later, in bed with Dashiell curled against his side, Thane pulled out his phone and composed a text to Isolde. "Thank you for taking care of him when I wasn't ready yet, and thank you for trusting me with him when I was." Her response came quickly. "You were always ready. You just needed to believe it. How's he doing?" "Perfect. We're both doing better than perfect, actually. We're doing possible. Possible is good. That's where everything starts." Thane set down his phone and allowed himself to simply exist in the moment. In a house that no longer felt like a memorial to the past, with a cat whose presence demanded present-tense attention, in a life that was not what he'd planned, but was becoming something he could recognize as his own. Change was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was incremental, built from hundreds of small decisions that accumulated into transformation, so gradual you barely noticed until you looked back and saw how far you'd traveled. 3 weeks ago, Thane had been a man paralyzed by grief and fear, unable to imagine caring about anything or anyone. Now he was a man with a cat, with routines, with reasons to open curtains and engage with a world that continued regardless of whether he participated. It was not a cure. Grief did not evaporate. Trauma did not magically heal, but it was movement, and movement was everything. Outside, spring deepened into its full expression. The lavender fields surrounding Riverbend burst into purple splendor, the oak trees leafed out in brilliant green, and the whole world seemed committed to the revolutionary act of continuing to grow, despite all the forces that worked against thriving. Inside the small craftsman bungalow on the quiet street, a man and a cat slept in mutual trust, each having found in the other what they most needed, proof that starting over was possible, that damage was not destiny, and that sometimes the best rescue involved two broken things deciding to be whole together. 6 weeks after Dashiell's adoption, an unexpected development arrived via Riverbend's email system. The message came from someone named Patricia Wyndham, subject line reading, "Information about the orange cat." Coralie opened it with the wariness of someone who had learned that unsolicited messages about specific animals rarely brought good news. "Dear Riverbend staff, I saw your recent posts about Dashiell, the orange and white cat whose age was discovered to be younger than initially assessed. I believe this cat may have belonged to my daughter and her ex-husband. They lived in Eugene until about 18 months ago when they separated. During the chaos of their split and subsequent moves, their cat, an orange and white male they had named August, went missing. They assumed he had run away or been hit by a car and eventually stopped looking. My daughter has since moved to California and her ex-husband moved to Nevada. Neither of them ever updated the microchip information after they adopted August from a different shelter 3 years ago, which is probably why no one contacted them when Dashiell was found. I'm reaching out because when I saw the photographs and read the story, I felt certain this was the same cat. The timing matches, the appearance matches, and the general area is correct. I don't know what you're legally required to do with this information, but I thought you should know. For what it's worth, neither my daughter nor her ex-husband have expressed interest in reclaiming the cat. Their lives have moved on, and they've both established new situations that don't include pets. I'm not trying to cause problems. I just thought the truth mattered. Patricia Wyndham." Coralie read the email 3 times, her heart rate increasing with each pass. She immediately forwarded it to Maris with the message, "We need to talk. This could be a problem." They convened at a coffee shop in town 30 minutes later, both of them looking like people who had received bad news and were trying to determine just how bad it was. "If this is true," Maris said, stirring her latte with unnecessary vigor, "we need to verify the microchip information. I can do that at the clinic, but Coralie, this could legally complicate Thane's adoption." "I know. But the woman said neither of the original owners wants him back. That has to count for something." "It counts for a lot morally, but legally, I don't know. We need to contact them directly, verify their intentions, and document everything meticulously." Maris set down her coffee untouched. "This is exactly what everyone who doubted us will point to, that we're either incompetent or actively covering up mistakes." "We're not covering up anything," Coralie said firmly. "We're handling new information as it comes and making decisions based on the best interest of the animal. That's literally our job." They decided on a course of action. Verify the microchip, contact both Patricia Wyndham and the original owners, document all communications, and determine legal standing before informing Thane. There was no point in creating panic if this turned out to be mistaken identity, or if the original owners had no interest in reclaiming Dashiell. Maris made the call to Patricia that afternoon, getting more details about the circumstances of August's disappearance. The story matched disturbingly well with what they knew about Dashiell's condition when found. A cat who had been wandering for an extended period, likely surviving on whatever he could catch or scavenge, slowly starving while his body consumed itself and his appearance aged prematurely. "The marriage was terrible at the end," Patricia explained over the phone. "Lots of fighting, lots of chaos. They were both so consumed with their own drama that I'm not sure they even noticed when the cat stopped coming home. By the time they realized he was gone for good, they were already separated and dealing with lawyers and division of assets. A missing cat just wasn't a priority. And you're certain neither of them wants him back? I spoke with my daughter this morning after I sent the email. She said, and I quote, 'I can barely take care of myself right now. I don't need a cat on top of everything else.' Her ex is apparently dating someone with severe allergies. They can't have pets in their home. Would they be willing to sign documentation formally relinquishing any claim to him? I think so. Especially if you explain that he's been adopted by someone who's taking good care of him. They're not cruel people, just overwhelmed." Life got complicated and the cat became a casualty of circumstances. Maris thanked her for the information and ended the call, then immediately pulled up Dashiell's file to check the microchip number documented during his intake examination. She called the National Registry, provided the number and waited while the representative searched the database. "We show a cat registered to Kevin and Melissa Dupree at an address in Eugene, Oregon. Registration date is 3 years ago. The cat's name is listed as August. Last update to the file was the initial registration. No changes to contact information since then." Maris thanked them and hung up, staring at her notes. The name matched what Patricia had provided for her ex-son-in-law. The timeline was correct. The location was right. This was not mistaken identity. Dashiell was August, and he had a documented history that predated his arrival at Riverbend. The question now was what to do with that information. She called Coralie back. It's confirmed. The microchip matches Patricia's story. We need to contact the Duprees directly and get their explicit statement about whether they want the cat back. I'll draft an email, Coralie said, her voice tight with stress. Factual, non-judgmental, focused on determining their current intentions. The email was sent that evening, addressed to both Kevin and Melissa Dupree at the last known email addresses the microchip registry had on file. It explained the situation clearly. Their former cat August had been found, had spent nearly a year in a shelter under a different name due to lack of current owner information, had since been adopted by someone new, and they needed to clarify whether they wished to reclaim ownership or formally relinquish any claim. The response came faster than expected. Melissa replied within 2 hours, "We are not interested in reclaiming August. We should have updated his microchip information before we separated, but we didn't, and that's on us. We're glad he's okay and that someone is taking care of him. Please proceed with whatever legal process makes his current adoption permanent. We don't want to cause problems for him or his new owner. We gave up the right to call ourselves his family when we let him disappear and didn't look hard enough to find him. Please don't contact us again about this. Melissa." Kevin's response came the next morning, shorter but equally definitive. "I agree with everything Melissa said. The cat is not our responsibility anymore. We're both in new situations, and August doesn't fit into either of them. Let him stay with whoever has him now. They're probably doing a better job than we did anyway. Kevin." Both responses were screenshot, printed, saved to multiple backup locations, and documented with timestamps. Coralie had both parties send follow-up emails explicitly stating they were voluntarily and permanently relinquishing all ownership claims to the cat, formerly known as August, now known as Dashiell. Both complied, and their attorney-reviewed statements were added to Dashiell's file. Only then did Coralie call Thane, her stomach knotted with anxiety about how he would receive this news. "Thane, it's Coralie from Riverbend. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Sure." His voice came through the phone, immediately concerned. "Is everything okay? Is Dashiell okay?" "Dashiell is fine, but I need to tell you something that's going to be complicated and potentially upsetting." She walked him through the entire situation: Patricia's email, the microchip verification, the contact with the original owners, and their explicit relinquishment of any claim. She spoke carefully, watching her tone to avoid sounding either defensive or dismissive of the seriousness of the information. When she finished, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then, "So his name was August?" "Yes. For the first year and a half of his life before he was lost, he was called August. And these people who lost him, they don't want him back. They've explicitly stated they have no interest in reclaiming him, and they support your adoption. We have that documented in multiple forms." More silence. Then, "Does he remember? Being August, I mean. Does he remember them?" Coralie felt her throat tighten. "I don't know. Cats have good memories, but we can't know what he retained or how he processed the experience of being lost and then rehomed. What I can tell you is that he's Dashiell now. He's your cat, legally and in every way that matters. This information doesn't change his current life. It just fills in some gaps about his past." "I need to think about this," Thane said. "Can I call you back?" "Of course, take whatever time you need, and Thane, this doesn't change anything about the adoption. He's still yours. That's not in question." After the call ended, Thane sat on his couch with Dashiell in his lap, stroking the orange fur while his mind tried to process this new information. The cat had another name, another life, another set of people who had claimed him and then abandoned him when circumstances became inconvenient. Everything Dashiell, August, had been through suddenly had more context, a clearer narrative of how a young cat ended up looking like a senior, how survival became his defining characteristic. "August," Thane said experimentally, and Dashiell's ears twitched at the sound, but he showed no recognition, no response beyond the normal acknowledgement of hearing a word. "Or maybe you've left August behind," Thane continued. "Maybe Dashiell is who you are now, shaped by everything that happened after you were lost. Maybe we get to choose which version of ourselves we carry forward." He thought about his own grief, his own tendency to define himself entirely by what he'd lost, rather than what remained or what might still be built. He thought about the choice to open curtains, to take care of something living, to believe that damaged things could still be whole. "We're keeping Dashiell," he said firmly, more to himself than the cat. "Not because August doesn't matter, but because Dashiell is who you became when you survived. That's worth honoring." He called Coralie back an hour later. "I've thought about it. Here's what I know. Whoever he was before doesn't change who he is now. Those people gave him up when he needed them, and that was their choice. I'm choosing to keep him. He's my cat. He's Dashiell. And that's the end of the story as far as I'm concerned." Relief flooded through Coralie's voice. "I'm so glad. And for what it's worth, I agree completely. His past gave him context, but his future is what matters." Thane hung up and looked down at the cat who was now irrevocably his, this creature who had survived abandonment and hardship and a year in a shelter cage, who had been misidentified and misunderstood, and finally seen for what he actually was, a young cat with years ahead of him, a survivor who had not let survival define him, a being who had learned to trust again, despite every reason not to. "We match," Thane told him. "Both of us carrying around these pasts we didn't choose, trying to figure out how to be something other than our damage. I think we're doing pretty well, considering." Dashiell purred his agreement, or at least his contentment, and Thane felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled since the phone call. The certainty that this was right, that they belonged together, that the complicated truth of Dashiell's history only made their bond more meaningful rather than less. Summer arrived with its characteristic intensity in western Oregon, the heat pressing down on the lavender fields until the entire region smelled like purple dreams. Thane's carpentry business picked up with seasonal demand, people wanting decks built, furniture commissioned, home renovations completed before school started in fall. He worked long hours, but never so long that he missed his routines with Dashiell. Isolde continued her regular visits, now joining them for dinner once a week, in an arrangement that benefited all three of them. She had started taking courses at the community college, beginning the slow process of building toward a degree in something that would let her work with animals professionally. Her anxiety had not disappeared, but had become more manageable, something she lived with rather than something that lived for her. "I've been thinking about the whole August thing," she said one evening over pasta, that Thane had actually cooked with moderate skill, about how he got to start over with a new name and a new life. "Yeah?" Thane prompted, twirling spaghetti around his fork. "It makes me think about how we're all kind of doing that, right? Like I'm not the same person I was when I first started volunteering at Riverbend. I've kept the name, but changed almost everything else. And you're not the same person you were before. Before everything changed, we get to decide what we keep from before and what we leave behind. That's remarkably philosophical for someone who's 19, Thane observed with a smile. I have a very wise therapist." Isolde reached down to pet Dashiell, who was supervising the dinner from his position under the table. "And I have this cat who taught me that surviving something hard doesn't mean you have to let it define everything that comes after." They finished dinner and moved to the living room for the increasingly standard routine of terrible television and comfortable silence. Dashiell claimed his spot on the couch between them, purring loudly enough to occasionally drown out the dialogue. These evenings had become sacred to all of them in different ways, proof that family could be constructed from whatever materials were available, that connection did not require blood relation or traditional structures. At the end of July, Soren reached out to Coralie with news. His photography series on long-term shelter residents had been accepted by a regional magazine with decent distribution. They wanted to feature Dashiell's story prominently, including the discovery of his real age and his eventual adoption by Thane. Would everyone be willing to participate in follow-up interviews and photos? Coralie called Thane to discuss. "You don't have to do this if it feels invasive or uncomfortable. Your privacy matters more than publicity for the shelter." But Thane surprised her by agreeing immediately. "If it helps other animals get adopted, if it makes people think twice about overlooking older cats or rough-looking ones, then I'm in. Dashiell's story deserves to be told." The interview and photo shoot happened on a Saturday afternoon at Thane's house. Soren brought his professional equipment and his artist's eye for capturing authentic moments rather than staged perfection. He photographed Dashiell in the window where he watched birds, on his special shelf in the woodshop, curled up on the bed that was no longer haunted by ghosts. He photographed Thane working on a furniture piece with Dashiell supervising, the two of them moving around each other with the casual choreography of established cohabitation. The resulting images were extraordinary. They captured not just a cat and his human, but the whole ecosystem of recovery that they had built together. The light in Thane's house, the creative chaos of his workshop, the comfortable wear of furniture that was used rather than preserved as memorial. Soren had managed to photograph hope without making it saccharine, reality without making it depressing. The article came out in September, titled "The Cat Who Wasn't Old After All," a story about assumptions, survival, and second chances. It told Dashiell's complete story, from his initial intake as a supposed senior, through the medical discovery of his real age, the revelation about his previous life as August, and his adoption by a widower, learning to live again. The writing was good, avoiding sensationalism while not shying away from the emotional truth of the narrative. The response was overwhelming. Riverbend's website crashed from traffic within hours of the article being shared online. Adoption inquiries increased by 300%. People shared the story across social media, with comments ranging from "This made me cry at work" to "I'm adopting a senior cat tomorrow because of this." The shelter received donations from people as far away as Europe, sent with notes explaining that Dashiell's story had moved them to support animal rescue in whatever way they could. Coralie called Thane when the wave of attention was at its peak. "We're getting adoption applications for every long-term resident we have. 3 cats who have been here over a year have approved adopters. 2 dogs are in the process of placement. I don't even have words. Dashiell changed everything." "Dashiell survived everything," Thane corrected gently. "That's what people are responding to. Not some feel-good rescue narrative, but the reality that damaged things can heal if they're given time and the right circumstances." That night, Thane showed the article to Dashiell, opening his laptop and scrolling through the images and text while the cat sat nearby with his characteristic patience. "You're famous now," Thane told him. "People all over are reading about how you survived being lost and scared and hungry, how you got misidentified as old when you were young, how you ended up here with me. They're inspired by you, apparently. By us." Dashiell yawned, completely unimpressed by his celebrity status, and proceeded to groom himself with focused attention to his back paws. "Yeah, I feel the same way about fame," Thane agreed. "Give me a quiet house and good company over publicity any day." But privately, he felt something shift inside him, a sense that their story mattered not just to them, but to other people who were struggling with loss, transition, or the feeling of being permanently broken. If Dashiell's survival could help someone else believe in possibility, then sharing it had been worth the temporary discomfort of attention. Fall arrived with its characteristic drama in Oregon, the oak trees exploding into gold and red, the temperature dropping enough to make evenings require extra blankets. Thane celebrated Dashiell's 1-year adoption anniversary with a special dinner and a new cat tree that he'd built himself in the woodshop, an elaborate structure with multiple levels, sisal scratching posts, and platforms positioned to maximize window viewing opportunities. Dashiell inspected the new furniture with thorough attention, eventually settling on the highest platform where he could survey his kingdom with the satisfaction of a cat who had transcended his former cage existence. Thane took a photo and sent it to Isolde with the caption, "1 year. Still can't believe we almost missed each other." Her response came quickly. "You didn't miss each other. The timing was exactly what it needed to be." That night, Thane sat at his kitchen table with a beer and a notebook, taking stock of the year that had passed since he walked into Riverbend and decided to try. The list he made was not comprehensive, but representative. Things that changed. I open curtains every day. I cook real meals sometimes. I talk to people without it feeling like torture. I can go into the bedroom without breaking down. I sleep through most nights. I laugh occasionally. I feel like a person again, instead of a collection of grief wearing human shape. I have a cat who depends on me and who I depend on right back. I can imagine a future that doesn't look exactly like the past. Things that stayed the same. I still miss Sarah every single day. I still have hard days when functioning feels impossible. I still cry sometimes for no immediate reason. I still struggle with the basic unfairness of losing someone you love. I still wonder what my life would look like if she hadn't died. Things I learned. You can hold grief and joy simultaneously. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. Moving forward doesn't erase what came before. Small daily actions accumulate into transformation. Being needed by something living makes you more alive. Cats are excellent therapists. Second chances are real if you're brave enough to try. He tore the page from the notebook and tacked it to his refrigerator, a reminder for future bad days when he needed evidence that progress was possible even when it didn't feel that way. Winter came with cold rain that made the inside of the house feel especially cozy. Thane and Dashiell developed cold weather routines. Mornings started with the fireplace lit. Evenings ended with both of them wrapped in the same blanket. Maris became a regular visitor, her professional relationship with Thane evolving into genuine friendship, and then gradually into something more careful and tentative that neither of them rushed to define. "I'm not ready for anything serious," Thane told her honestly one evening when the question of their status became unavoidable. "Good," Maris replied. "Neither am I. I'm still figuring out who I am outside of being my father's daughter and running his clinic. We can figure it out together without pressure or expectations." So they did, slowly, with frequent check-ins and communication that felt revolutionary in its honesty. Some evenings Maris came over and they cooked together. Other times they maintained separate lives with only occasional intersection. It was not a romance novel relationship, but something more sustainable. Two adults with their own damage and complications, choosing to share space without losing themselves in the process. Dashiell approved of Maris, showing her the same preference he'd shown Thane that first day, immediate recognition of someone trustworthy, someone who would not cause harm. He would curl up between them on the couch during movie nights, purring loudly enough to require subtitle adjustment, serving as the physical connector in a relationship that was still finding its shape. The second winter of Dashiell's residency with Thane brought its own challenges. A cold snap burst pipes in the workshop requiring expensive repairs. Thane's truck died and needed replacement, eating into savings he'd been carefully maintaining. He got sick with flu that left him bedbound for a week, barely capable of taking care of himself, let alone a dependent animal. But Maris stepped in to help with Dashiell's care, and Isolde stopped by with soup and groceries, and Thane learned the hard lesson that accepting help was not weakness but wisdom. Through all of it, Dashiell remained his constant. The warm weight on the bed when fever made everything hurt. The insistent demand for food that forced Thane to get up even when he wanted to surrender to misery. The patient companionship that asked nothing except continued presence. "You're my anchor," Thane told him during one of those long, sick days. "I keep thinking about what my life would look like without you, and I literally can't imagine it anymore. You've become essential." Dashiell responded by kneading Thane's chest with his paws, his purr vibrating through the blankets and into Thane's aching ribs. It was perhaps the most perfect response possible, acknowledgement without words, connection without complication. Spring returned with its ritual insistence on renewal, the lavender fields preparing for another cycle of bloom. Riverbend had its best year on record, the attention from Dashiell's story generating sustained increases in adoptions and donations. Coralie hired 2 additional staff members, finally able to pay proper salaries instead of relying entirely on volunteers. The shelter expanded its medical capabilities, added climate control to the dog section, and developed partnerships with other rescue organizations to create a regional network for difficult placements. Beckett still lived in his cottage on the property, still maintained the infrastructure with quiet competence, still served as the unofficial therapist for everyone who worked at Riverbend. He was 70 now, slowing down in ways he tried to hide, but everyone noticed. When asked about retirement, he laughed and said what would be the point. This was home. These were his people, even if they weren't related by blood. Isolde completed her first year of college, with grades good enough to transfer to a 4-year university. She had decided to pursue veterinary technology, inspired by watching Maris work, and understanding that she wanted a career where precision and compassion were equally valued. She still volunteered at Riverbend on weekends, still considered it the place that saved her life by giving her purpose when she had felt purposeless. Soren's photography series won a regional award, leading to more commissions and opportunities. He donated a significant portion of his award money to Riverbend, acknowledging that his career boost had come directly from telling Dashiell's story. His relationship with the shelter evolved from casual volunteer to official documentarian, his photographs becoming the primary tool for generating adoption interest. And in the small craftsman bungalow on the quiet street, Thane Carmody lived a life he had not imagined possible 3 years earlier, when Sarah died. He was not the same person he'd been before her death, but he was also not the broken ghost he'd been in its immediate aftermath. He was something new, constructed from grief and survival and daily choice, held together by routine and responsibility, and the love of a cat who had also been broken and rebuilt. On the anniversary of Sarah's death, the third one since she passed, Thane took Dashiell with him to the cemetery. It was an unusual choice, bringing a cat to a gravesite, but Thane had learned that grief made its own rules, and traditional approaches often missed what actually helped. He sat on the ground next to Sarah's headstone, with Dashiell in his lap, and talked to his dead wife the way he'd been doing for 3 years. But this time felt different, less like obligation and more like integration, bringing her memory into his current life rather than existing in 2 separate realities that never touched. "I got a cat," he told her. "I know we always talked about it, but never did it. His name is Dashiell and he's orange and white, and he survived something terrible that I'll never fully understand. He reminds me of us, actually. The surviving part, I mean. The way you have to just keep going even when everything in you wants to stop." Dashiell sat quietly in Thane's lap, seemingly understanding that this moment required stillness rather than his typical explorations. "I'm dating someone," Thane continued. "Her name is Maris, and she's the one who figured out Dashiell wasn't as old as everyone thought. She's smart and kind, and she has her own damage from losing her dad, so we understand each other in ways that feel important. I think you'd like her. I think you'd approve of me trying to build something new, instead of just maintaining a memorial to what I lost." The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling leaves and making the dozens of flower arrangements shift and sway. Thane breathed deeply, feeling the spring air fill his lungs, feeling alive in a way that was no longer complicated by guilt. "I still miss you," he said firmly. "That hasn't changed and won't change. But I've learned I can miss you and still live, still find joy, still create meaning. Dashiell taught me that, actually. He had this whole traumatic past, but he doesn't let it prevent him from being happy now. He just exists in the present, with the past as context but not as prison. I'm trying to do the same thing." He sat for another 20 minutes, then stood and gathered Dashiell back into his carrier for the drive home. As he walked away from the grave, he did not feel like he was leaving Sarah behind, but rather carrying her forward in a different form, as memory rather than wound, as foundation rather than prison. That evening, Maris came over for dinner. They cooked together, Thane handling the main course while Maris made a salad that was far more elaborate than his cooking skills could have managed. They ate at the kitchen table with Dashiell winding between their legs, begging shamelessly, despite having been fed his own dinner earlier. They talked about their days, about plans for the summer, about nothing of great consequence and everything that mattered. "I love you," Maris said suddenly, setting down her wine glass and looking at Thane with the kind of directness that suggested she'd been holding the words for a while and decided to release them regardless of timing or circumstance. Thane felt his breath catch, not from panic but from the significance of the moment. "I love you too," he replied honestly. "It's different than before with Sarah, but it's real, and I'm glad we found each other." "Me too." They finished dinner and moved to the living room, and Dashiell claimed his spot between them with the authority of a cat who knew exactly where he belonged. The television played something neither of them really watched, and the house settled into its evening rhythms. Familiar sounds and comfortable silence, the baseline of a life that had been rebuilt from fragments into something whole. Later that night, in bed with Dashiell curled against his side, Thane thought about the past 3 years. Sarah's death, the impossible grief that followed, the slow recognition that he needed to find a way to keep living. The day he walked into Riverbend intending to get a kitten, and ended up drawn repeatedly to an orange and white cat everyone said was too old. The discovery that changed everything, that Dashiell wasn't old at all, just damaged in ways that made him seem ancient. The decision to adopt anyway, to take responsibility for a life that was fragile and uncertain, the daily choice to show up, to take care of something, to let himself be needed and to acknowledge his own needs in return. It had not been easy. There had been setbacks and hard days and moments when Thane wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But there had also been progress, measured in open curtains and cooked meals and laughter that didn't feel like betrayal. There had been the expansion of his world to include Maris and Isolde, connections that enriched rather than drained. There had been the gradual understanding that healing was not linear, that you could be both broken and whole simultaneously. that moving forward did not require erasing the past. And there was Dashiell, always Dashiell, the cat who had been abandoned and starved and misidentified, who had spent nearly a year in a cage, waiting for someone to see him clearly, who had finally found a home with someone equally uncertain, equally damaged, equally committed to the difficult work of continuing to exist despite everything that made existence feel impossible. "We made it," Thane whispered into the darkness. "Both of us. We actually made it," Dashiell purred in response, that familiar rumbling sound that had become the soundtrack of Thane's new life. It was not the life he would have chosen if choice had been available. Sarah would still be alive in that imagined alternative, and he would have never experienced the particular grief that had nearly destroyed him. But this life, the one he actually inhabited, was not without its own value. It was real and hard-won and built from salvaged pieces, and it was his. Outside, the season turned towards summer. The lavender would bloom soon, filling the air with that distinctive scent of renewal. The days would grow longer, the warmth would return, and the world would continue its cycle of death and rebirth that made no exceptions for human preference or feline survival stories. Inside the small craftsman bungalow, a man and a cat slept in mutual trust and hard-earned peace, their breathing synchronized, their bodies warm against each other, their futures uncertain but faced together. And that, after everything, was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered.